Let me tell you of a story of these type of people that you should never be, that you should never strive to be. These people, they were a frighteningly diligent people. They would clear forests and hunt animals even when they had no need. They developed techniques to preserve food they were unable to eat and earned more money that could ever be spent. Yet there was not a single one among them who did not accept these practices, for none knew of any other customs. They were a frighteningly studious people. Their grasp of calculation and science exceeded any pretense of practicality, and they would repeatedly engage in spirited debates regarding the predictions of the future. They invented an increasingly difficult language and created an infinite series of complex machines which they would immediately discard. But there was not a single one among them who looked back, for none knew of any concern. They were a frighteningly obedient people. Without ever being told, they would greet the morning sun at the same time, in the same clothes, while toiling away in the same cramped rooms. Yet there was not a single one among them who complained, for none knew what else they should be doing. And I'm sure you know what happens, right? Having worked far too much, the people lost their forests and took to living atop the sand. Having grown far too intelligent, the people conversed in a language that no other peoples could comprehend. Having grown far too well behaved, the people were unable to defy the laws that would be established one after the other, and came to live their lives enclosed by tens of thousands of rules. Senior? Huh? You see? Don't live your life like this, my friend. Otherwise, you might regret it. Those people were scarily hardworking. They tore through forests and hunted animals, though they had no need to. They learned how to preserve food that they could not finish, and tried to unnecessarily save up money. However, there were none who questioned this, because everyone was doing it. Those people were scarily studious. They repeatedly did numerical calculations that had no application and predicted the future. Repeating their arguments, they created numerous difficult languages, made tons of complicated machinery that they threw away right after. However, there were none who looked back, because nobody realized. Those people were scarily obedient. When the sun rose, they got up at the same time, put on the same clothes, and began their work in a stuffy room out of their own will. However, there were none who complained, because they did not know what to do otherwise. Those people who overlooked themselves lost their forest and live on sand now. Those people who were too smart for their own good could only talk in a language that nobody else understood. Those people who behaved too well could not defy the laws that were continuously made, and lived surrounded by tens of thousands of laws. In a far-off land, there was a man who acted as a double for the nation's prince, performing duties in his stead as required. One day, having finished his work, he returned to the prince's chambers to find the princess lying naked in his bed. As the double stood in place, dumbfounded, the man who shared his face sneered and invited him to join them. The double loved the prince's sister, and he felt that the princess, who admired him as her brother, loved him as well. Indeed, she was the only thing that kept him going in this otherwise miserable job, for the prince was the most despicable man indeed. Eventually, it came to pass that a war was to be waged under the prince's command. The night before it was to begin, the prince took his double aside and promised him a night with his sister if he could bring him the head of the enemy general. And as the prince chuckled with delight, the double took up his spear and thrust it through the prince's gaping mouth. The war was over. The prince made a queen of his sister and would inflict wounds upon his face and throat, an act which would occur every time she called out to him, using her brother's name. Before long, the prince was found dead, his face burned and his spear thrust through his open mouth. The man's face, hideously burned, was a picture of serenity. In a certain country, there lived a man who acted as a double for the prince. The man took care of official business every day in place of the prince. When he went to the prince after finishing a day's work, he found a naked woman sleeping in his room. The woman was the prince's sister. A man with the same face stared at the man's shocked impression and invited him to join in while laughing flippantly. The man loved the prince's sister. He also felt that she, who adored him like an older brother, loved him back. Even if he goes through every day in a facade, she was the only thing he was living for. He who put his life on the line for the most despicable prince. The prince took command during the war. He told this to the man who was prepared to risk his life to accomplish his job. If he managed to take the enemy commander's head, then the prince would let him sleep with his sister once. The man shoved a spear through the prince's mouth as he laughed flippantly. After the war, the prince made his sister his wife and began to injure his own face and throat. He repeated his actions every time his sister called him Big Brother. Eventually, the prince was found with his face burned and a spear impaling him in the mouth. His burned face looked very calm.